Premjith who is the ambassador of the Republic of Singapore to Egypt. If you may join me on the stage, Your Excellency. Ambassador, always a pleasure to have you, and I always appreciate the fact that you're very active, always supporting these opportunities where we can create dialogue and exchange information between Egypt and Singapore. And I've had the honor of moderating sessions and having these one-on-one sessions with you for quite some time. We talked about global competitiveness. We've talked about the third-party logistics. We've talked about logistic hubs, we've talked about education, we've talked about all of these things, and I always refer back to Singapore because you're one of the top 3 most competitive nations in the world and have been for the past 6-7 years with all of these fantastic indicators, and maybe the least one was market size. We had that discussion at one point. But when we talked about an energy hub, one of the things that we had to look at was Singapore, because unlike Mexico and Egypt, where we have natural resources that might not currently be utilized due to the lack of some of the things we talked about, infrastructure, technology, information, accessibility to finance, to be able to pull this out. Now, Singapore is completely different. You have no natural resources. And as brilliantly as you have achieved, in my opinion, in the past 60 years, great strides in education, logistics, and everything, necessity has created Singapore in a sense. Now, maybe this is the first time we're talking about the oil and gas industry together and the digital transformation. So, if I can take from your time to understand what is the process we've talked about about its consequence to become a hub as a consequence of policy and so forth. You are actually established more mature in Egypt, more mature than Mexico in that field. What was the policy? What was it that makes Singapore once again very successful in this field to become such a regional hub in terms of oil, gas, petrochemicals, and all of this?
Thank you. First, let me thank the organizers as well as yourself and the Ministry of Petroleum for having me on this Egypt Energy Hub conference. I've been 5.5 years in Egypt, and in the last 1 year, I think there has been tremendous interest in this whole idea of Egypt becoming an energy hub, and I'm very happy to be able to share our own experiences in developing that. To answer your question, I think when we are a very young country compared to Egypt. In the 60s, we decided very early on when we became independent that there was a need in the region at that time, because remember in the 60s there was a Cold War, and none of them in the region had any credible, reliable petroleum facilities. So in other words, we basically filled in a particular need. But we went around, at that time Singapore was quite a relatively poor country, so we needed to rely on oil majors to come in, but it required us to convince them to move some of their operations out of the US, in Europe, and even in Japan, to move their regional hub operations to Singapore. So it's about trying to convince them, putting together a kind of a package. Fast forward, we came to 80s, we realized that petroleum refinery alone is not going to give us the economic benefits. So in the 80s, within the government, we decided that we needed to go into chemicals in a big way. And given that our projections at that time, I mean, we take a 30, 40, 50-year time frame for our whole economic development. And I want to come back to this because being a hub, from our own experience, is that this is not a 5-year, 10-year enterprise. This is essentially a 40, 50-year goal. And to be able to be a real hub, one, the government really has to be a fair regulator and not get involved in the space of the private sector. Because the moment the government becomes an actor in the private sector space, you are not going to have a level playing field, and your hub status will very soon become a non-level playing field. So our own experience is for the government to be completely out of this whole energy space.
And Your Excellency, we're just differentiating here between the government and the public sector.
Sorry?
We're differentiating here between the government and the public sector.
Yes, yes. I mean, if the public sector enterprise is involved in that space, but as one of the actors without, because ultimately foreign investors and domestic investors are going to pump in money into this space only if they think that they have a chance at winning. But if you are going to have the government, the public, and the private all in the same space, but as I think as our Mexican distinguished speaker said, prices, information have to be credible. If you have to get information through other sources, then obviously it is not going to be a precondition or prerequisite for a successful hub. Having said that, let me give you as well as our friends here, I've got 5 aspects of the entire ecosystem that we really look at. Some of the factors have been covered by our Mexican speaker, but I will mention all 5 but very briefly go into some of them. One is capital discipline, because having capital discipline means making sure that you have sufficient capital for long-term building of the hub. Here, as our Mexican speaker said, infrastructure. When it comes to infrastructure, we do not outsource it to the private sector. The thinking, the national direction is done by the government in consultation with the private sector. That's how every 10-15 years we fine-tune our whole industrial transformation map. Today, the biggest discussion that we're having with our current players in the Singapore energy chemicals hub space is about sustainability. I mean, this is not something that was actively discussed 5-10 years ago, but today everyone is talking about sustainability, how to lower the whole carbon footprint. So that's part of the whole discussion. The second one is what we call in Singapore skills future. In other words, to encourage our investors, domestic as well as foreign investors, to put in money for 30 to 40 years. And we want big companies, my director for British Petroleum is here, they have $10 billion invested in the energy and the chemical sector in Singapore. And when he speaks, asking why they keep pumping in more money. And I think one of the big reasons is the environment is predictable. No foreign players think that Singapore's laws favor the domestic or the foreign. They all feel that they can get a much rather fair outcome. And I think more importantly, compared to many other countries, I think the thing we tend to focus much more is government subsidizes, and I know our Mexican speaker doesn't like the word subsidy, but we subsidize education in a big way. In other words, we don't take it for granted that the private sector will produce the skilled and the technical knowledge, manpower for our 40-50-year vision that we have. And foreign investors are going to come in and not expect to train your manpower. So we take it upon ourselves that if we want Singaporeans to get good jobs, Singapore must invest in its own people. So at the end of all hubs, whether we are a trading hub, financial hub, energy hub, chemicals hub, at the end of the day, you need to have the people in order to support this vision. So the government in Singapore takes an active leading interest in understanding what the needs are of all these investors, and we make sure we produce the skilled manpower. For example, today we are heavily investing in engineering, applied sciences, robotics, artificial intelligence, and this is not just in our universities, but this is also coming out from our polytechnics, our Institute of Technical Institutes, which means that they are 1 or 2 steps lower than a university. So in other words, we take an ecosystems type of an approach to support our economic objectives. I'll stop there. If you want to ask me a question, sure.
No, I'm just very, very curious, just to go back to what Mexico did with some of its reform, and I think once you put energy into constitutional reform, how is the energy sector? It's not regulated to really put it in the constitution. I don't know how to express it, but do you go as far as have regulation of or management of the energy sector in Singapore in the constitution, or is it just laws? I mean, have you gone that far to make sure that it happens?
Our constitution is only very few pages, so we are very law-light. But I think when it comes to how, I think it's a very important question. Laws, rules, regulations are not process-oriented. They are outcome-oriented. In other words, when we want to create competition, all of them know what the final goals are. Anything that is not in the laws is free and open game. But what is clear is anybody who violates the rules or the letter of the rule of law, then of course the hammer will fall. But so far we found that given the space, the open space that we have created, we believe that if you have too many laws, it stifles ideas. So the regulators take a very light approach to things, because we want to also encourage players to experiment. Because through experiment is where you get ideas, new ideas that will come about. But by having too tight laws, what you can do and what you cannot do, I'm afraid that is not going to create a type of dynamic ecosystem that we want.
And I think one of the things that I almost tried to avoid mentioning when I was speaking with Rosanetta earlier, one of the dire issues they were facing in their industry, and hence required that major, let's say, extreme action towards, is corruption. Maybe something that Singapore doesn't suffer from as much as country as Mexico, but I think that's maybe why it's a little bit easier for it. Let me ask you the final question here. Singapore is very innovative. It supports the entrepreneurship, ecosystems, small, medium enterprises. I mean, really pushes that. When we come and talk about the challenges faced by the oil and gas industry, or overall in terms of transforming into a digital approach, a digital economy in a sense, we both say that it's very expensive. We need to invest in digital transformation, information technology. We have great companies like Raya IT, but maybe a handful of them, or maybe less. But Singapore is a little bit different. If you can just tell us the importance within that ecosystem, in creating your homegrown technologies and research to become a digital hub. It's not just importing the technologies from abroad. That's how expensive it becomes. But the ecosystem actually creates the information technology, creates the systems, creates the people that can actually do research and implementation. So it's education again at the end of the day. But what do you do in terms of not the oil and gas industry, but for the technology that is required for digital transformation? Is it local grown? Is that the result of the schooling, education that you're talking about? Or do you still import a lot of the technologies that you utilize? Because this is something we have to be very focused on here in Egypt as well. To create homegrown information technology solutions and applications for the sectors, rather than complain that it's very expensive because we have to bring it from abroad. So what's your take on that? Homegrown versus...
Ours is a mixture of both. For example, our entire energy and chemicals industry, it's all co-located in one island called the Jurong Island. And on this island we have petrochemical players, we have chemical players, we have LNG players, we have LPG players, and now increasingly, because of demand that's coming out, we are also looking at biorenewables on sugar and palm oil. And sugar and palm oil are huge resources in our region, which is untapped. But because we co-locate all these people in one, there is a continuous free flow of ideas between domestic investors and foreign investors. And it is this competition and also co-located in the Jurong Island. We also have innovation labs, people who are experimenting. We have university researchers who are coming in, talking to players. We have also our players traveling around the world, looking at how the Europeans and Americans and the British are doing. And from there, I won't say, if you ask me, pinpoint exactly how much of it is homegrown, I would say that it is about 40-50%. But I won't tell you that this is a precise figure because some of it is co-produced.
So it's sort of homegrown, co-produced, and then imported. So we look at it from these sides.
For example, in Egypt, a Singapore company produced a smart card for 40% of the population, for example. We did this in the 1990s. Today, 40% of Egyptians are using smart cards to buy their daily necessities, for example. And I think in the next 2 to 3 months, this smart card is going to be extended to buy fuel so that we do not use subsidies anymore. I think that is President Sisi's plan. This is another example of how digitalization can leapfrog economic development.
Let me ask you the final question, Your Excellency. The sentiment after Egypt's claim for self-sufficiency in energy and our ambitions to become an energy hub, and we're realizing that slowly but surely, maybe it has to be a 50-year plan. What is the interest, appetite of Singapore investors? We know how their appetite for third-party logistics and the ports and the transportation. Is there an investment appetite, or how can I say? One is an investment appetite actually coming in and investing in the sector, whether it's in oil, gas, or technology. Or are they interested to come and recruit some of their technologies and products and sell it here in Egypt? So what is the sentiment after? What's the news getting to the Singaporean businesses and private sector? How do they view Egypt's sort of push? Is there potential for investment for them?
In all sectors or in a... I think oil and gas sector, I mean, so far it has been very limited, to be absolutely frank. About 5-6 years ago, Singapore provided a floating gas regasification when some of your LNG facilities were not operating. But now that Egypt is moving, or at least found huge deposits of gas in Zoba, and also I think we have 2 LNG facilities, one in Damiata and the other one is in Iku. When these become operational, you not only may have enough for domestic consumption, but also for some exports. But I think it's still too early to tell whether Egypt will have access gas for export, although it's been repeated so often, but sometimes the hype can only take you up to a point.
Excellency, it's always such a pleasure to have you, and thank you again for being with us and exploring the possibilities and sharing the experiences of Singapore, and we're really happy to have these international partners with us where we can share these experiences. Thank you very much.